All right, everybody, welcome back. We're on to Unit 2, and we're going to jump right into our real subject matter now. Really appreciate everybody doing their introductions. It's good to learn a little bit about everybody, to understand what motivates you in certain situations. And so it was very enlightening for me. I hope you got to know somebody that you hadn't met before in the class and know a little bit about them so we can all work together as a cohesive team. So this week we're going to talk about public versus corporate investigations. And knowing the difference really will impact the way you approach an investigation in the corporate setting. If you don't know the difference, if you don't understand the difference between the two, you are destined to fail. And I have seen investigators fail miserably because they went into a corporate investigation with the mindset of a public investigation. Several of them had that background. Others just had that perception of how it should be done, and seldom is that successful. So we're going to go and talk a little bit about the differences between the two, and why that's important to know it, and what that does as far as impact on how you approach an investigation. So let's just talk about that perception right away. So I want you to kind of close your eyes. You don't have to close your eyes. I can't see if you do anyway. But I want you to think about an investigator. An investigator that you know you've seen somewhere, movies, TV, real life, someone you know. Just think about that investigator. And who did you see? Was it somebody like a Dirty Harry? Somebody like an Elliot Stabler from SVU, which I think we've probably all seen. I think we all have a general exposure to an investigator that is an investigator in the criminal realm. We think about investigators in terms of investigators that we see on TV or that we've known, detectives that we've known in our personal life perhaps, and we have that perception of what that person is and what they do. And that exposure really influences our perception of what an investigator and an investigation is. And that perception can become reality. Perceptions can become reality very quickly, whether they're true perceptions or false perceptions. They still become our reality. And when we are exposed to investigations in a certain way, we see them in a certain way, and that becomes how we see them. We need to reconsider that reality. We need to understand what a corporate investigation is before we jump into the study of them. Mainly because if you try to think of them in the terms of the criminal investigation perception you have, you will really start to scratch your head and say, this doesn't sound anything like what I'm used to, what I expected it to be. And I think that we need to get those things off the table, and that's why this week we're really dedicated to the differences between the two, so you can open your mind and accept the rest of the lessons we have in store for you on how to do a corporate investigation. So what are some of these differences? And there are lots of them, and these are just a few really, but there are many, many more we could talk about. Authority. There's a difference in authority, obviously, where it comes from. The sources of information you can use and you have available to you. Job security is one that you have to think about, and we'll get into that a little bit. The scope of work is definitely different. The image of the corporate investigator and the public investigator are different, and those images come from different places. The civil liability is certainly something that's different between a public and a private/corporate investigator. The technical resources that you have available to you and that you're used to using and that you can pull out of the hat are certainly different. And then prosecution decisions, which I believe is the one key that makes corporate investigations much more interesting, much more fulfilling for me, and a much easier job in some ways than the public when it comes to what you do with the results of the investigation. So let's break each one of these down individually and talk about them. Authority. A public investigator derives their authority from law, and efforts are funded through taxation. They have a loyalty to the public and to the law, and that loyalty is unwavering. They must do what is best for the public at large. That is their client, their customer, and there's no question that what they do has to be what's in the best interest of the public. Now, a corporate investigator gets their authority from a board of directors, or from their manager, or from somewhere in the leadership of their corporation or their organization if they happen to be a nonprofit. And the loyalty goes back to that organization and the owners, or stockholders, if you will, in that organization. So while a public investigator has to do what's best for the public, the corporate investigator has to consider what's best for the public, and unless bound by law to do so, must make their decisions and do what's best for their company and for their organization. So there's a different loyalty there, and the authority really comes from that association. So public investigators are rarely asked not to investigate something because there's just not time or funds for it. Now, there are exceptions. I think we probably have all heard of police departments, Detroit being the one that comes to mind for me, that has a backlog of 10 years worth of rape kits that they have not yet run through a lab. And that's because they don't have the funding to do so. So is not doing their job in the public interest? No, it's not, simply because we don't know how many of those rape kits are tied to single entities and single rapists, which may still be a great public threat. But they're very seldom asked to do that. That's not something where, we'll take on an investigation as a police detective. They say, okay, but you've only got a month to get this done. That doesn't really happen. The case takes you where the case takes you, whereas a corporate investigator has to choose their cases based on priority and available resources. So if I have a case presented to me of an employee who is stealing batteries out of the supply closet, okay? If I'm a police detective and I get a complaint that someone is stealing from someone else, I have to put a certain amount of time into that case. I have to go and take statements. I have to determine whether or not I'm going to refer that to a prosecutor, whether a crime's been committed or not, and the like. As a corporate investigator, I can say, okay, so you're telling me Johnny is stealing batteries from the storeroom. I have the opportunity, if I think it's in the company's best interest, to call in Johnny and say, Johnny, stop stealing batteries from the storeroom, and closing that out. So I have to worry about the fact that if I were to do an investigation, I could set up a trap for Johnny. I could put up a camera and watch him steal batteries and pay for that camera and pay for the time it would take for somebody to review that and put it up for me and all those things. But based on priority and available resources, I'm not going to pursue that investigation. Where the police, if a complaint is made, they may not have to put the same effort behind every investigation, but they must put some effort behind every complaint. Whereas in the course of a corporate investigation, you decide how much effort is going into that particular investigation based on the needs of the company, priority of resources, and their availability. The sources of information we use are very much the same, but their availability is very much different. So public investigators have access, to arrest records. And let's stop for a minute and think about the difference between arrests and convictions. Someone may have been arrested 20 times and never been convicted of a crime. That may simply be because the prosecutor thought that their behavior was not such that it rose to a priority for them to bring this through the court system. So they could have been arrested 20 times for petty theft, always stealing, a pack of gum every time from the local 7-Elevens or convenience stores, Sheetz, whatever we have, right? Every time they go into the store, they steal a pack of gum. Store owners report that, and the prosecutor says, I'm not taking somebody forward for stealing a pack of gum. But they've done it 20 times. The police would have access to those records of the complaint. Whereas I, as a corporate investigator, may only have, and I say may because I sometimes have to pay for the right to view it, depending on the state or country, and some countries have no right to see it, but I would have to pay for the right to see a conviction record, that a prosecutor took something forward and a court found the person guilty, and they were given a sentence of some type, be it probation or jail time or whatever, for a crime. I can see that, but I can't see the number of arrests, and that has a lot to do with suspects. If that person has 20 arrests for stealing packs of gum, but no convictions, and a store owner calls and said, there was a guy in here just a little while ago, he stole a pack of gum and he left, but I don't know who he is. As a police, public investigator, I probably got a pretty good idea who that guy is because he's always stealing packs of gum. As a corporate investigator, I wouldn't know that because there are no convictions, and if somebody said that, I just had a pack of gum stolen and there was a guy in here, I would have no idea where to start because I don't have access to those arrest records, only convictions. However, as a corporate investigator, there are records that I have access to that others do not. So it could be that I have records from a previous employer on a background or a reference check, right? Behavioral issues. If I have someone who makes a complaint about someone who is stealing packs of gum, I may have records where the person was written up by their manager for taking things that belonged to others in the past. So that may lead me down the path of, okay, my most likely suspect is someone who's done this in the past. So they're not arrests, but they are behavioral records that the police would not have access to. And there are lots of examples of people that do things at work that would never think to do those things at home. I always say that people have a different personality at work. You will find that someone who is an absolute scoundrel outside of work, they may have, spousal abuse issues and drinking issues and drug issues, and they come to work and they are the perfect employee. Or they are the pillar of the community and no one would think that they would ever do a bad thing, and they come to work and they are a jerk at work and they are mean to everybody, they harass other people, they're bullies. I think in some cases there's anecdotal evidence certainly that people have two personalities, the work personality and the home personality. And I have access to the work personality history, whereas the police have access to the home and the external behavioral records. So a corporate investigator has no more rights to info than any other citizen. Now, we have developed methods and tools where we can get arrest records and conviction records, and in some cases get them as quick as the police do. But we have no right to that information, and that is a bit of a hamstring, although again, we have that trade-off of that internal information that gives us insight into a person's behavior. You may not think job security is an issue, but it is indeed, because the public investigator generally belongs to a police union or is a public employee with certain rights in their employment agreement where they have arbitration and they have protections. And a bad investigation is not normally going to result in the loss of their job. How many times have we seen someone be arrested falsely, accused falsely, and the investigators in the case many times don't even apologize? A city or county might get sued, which is a rarity, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and have to pay out to the person who was wrongfully accused or arrested. But those investigators are often just put right back on the job again because they have a fair amount of job security. Now, a corporate investigator doesn't have that because we wouldn't be a member of a union. And in fact, as agents of management, we would be prohibited from joining a union normally. You'll find that if you are in a union environment, the security guards normally belong to a different union, if they are unionized, than the ones who are part of the operating unit of the company. So in a car plant, almost everybody is a UAW member, but the security guards are normally part of a plant protection union or SEIU. So there's a difference there, and corporate investigators don't have those protections. So does that make a difference in how we approach investigation? Oh, heck yes, because one bad investigation, one firing that goes wrong because they found a flaw in your investigation, and the next firing may be you. So we have a different standard when it comes to making sure that we have everything in the right place before we take a case forward. Mainly because we have a fair amount of personal liability when it comes to these types of cases. There tends to be a difference in the scope of work and the type of work, obviously, that public and corporate investigators do. But public investigators tend to become specialists over time, especially in big police departments or big law enforcement units, depending on what the jurisdiction may be. They become theft experts. They become homicide detectives. They become experts in investigating terrorism or vehicle crimes. Whereas a corporate investigator tends to be a generalist. A corporate investigator very seldom has a narrow scope of cases that they hire. If there's a theft of company property, they get that. If there is a harassment coming in, they get that. If it's an embezzlement coming in, they get that. Now, there are some corporate investigators that are different. My own company has brand protection investigators that work on counterfeit products. That is becoming a bit of a specialty, and in fact, there are degree programs even dedicated to it now. But that is the exception rather than the rule. Fraud investigators, again. However, fraud investigators and forensic investigators, for you cybersecurity students, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I don't want to insult anybody. I wouldn't call them investigators at all, not in the classic sense. Now, are they conducting an investigation? Are they putting pieces of evidence together? Yes, they are, but seldom will they take that investigation through. The forensic investigator in this course, we'll be referring to them as witnesses, quite frankly, because they have information that aids in the overall investigation, but very seldom will the person who is a cyber investigator or a fraud investigator take that investigation from the moment of discovery all the way through prosecution. They normally hand that off to someone in a generalist type of environment who is a specialist, if you will. A generalist is a specialist. A generalist who has experience in taking cases forward for prosecution or to their presentation mode. So in that, the public investigator gains some depth. They learn, a homicide investigator will know everything about homicide investigations. because they work it and that's what they do. Whereas a corporate investigator working a wide variety of types of cases, whatever comes in is yours. We get breadth. We get to learn a lot about a lot of things, but we don't get the depth. We would never learn everything about a theft investigation or way to do a theft investigation the way someone who just does thefts in a police department might do. The vehicle theft person who works vehicle thefts at the NYPD will certainly know an awful lot more about vehicle theft investigations than I would, who I probably handled maybe 4 vehicle thefts from facilities in my entire career. They just get that depth because they do it more often. They, however, would not know how to handle potentially an embezzlement case. I've probably handled a dozen or more of those in my career, whereas they may have handled none. So realistically, the public investigators tend to be specialists, and the private corporate investigators tend to have a breadth of knowledge as generalists, and that's the difference in the scope of work between the two. So some of this difference between the two comes from image, and it's a good spot now to talk about that. I hope you've seen some of the differences, and there's a few more to talk about, but some of the differences between a public investigator, a police investigator, let's call them that for simplicity, and a corporate investigator who works for a private entity. And I distinguish between a corporate investigator and a private investigator in such that a private investigator is one for hire, whereas a corporate investigator works directly for a particular entity. But a lot of it has to do with the image. And so I'm going to ask you to think about this. I introduce you to my friend, and I'll say, this is my friend Bill. Bill is a detective sergeant with the Pittsburgh Police Department. Immediately you have an image of what Bill does for a living and how Bill probably will act, right? He's going to be a little aloof. He's going to suspect everyone and trust no one. He's going to be probably a pretty serious guy. And you've got that image. Whereas if I say, this is my friend Bill, he's a corporate investigator, you don't really have much of an image of that. Most people don't. They'll generally say, oh, okay, the guy's a corporate investigator. And that's not as, in most people's mind, as impressive as being a police detective. And normally people think of a corporate investigator as being the company thug and protective of the company. Now, to some extent, as we talked about, you do have that loyalty to the company and to the organization because that is how the law is laid out. But the images are different. Public investigators inherit that standing. Remember, when I said this is Bill and he's a police detective, you probably thought different things about Bill, that he was competent, that he was squared away, that he was trustworthy. And he inherited that. You know nothing about Bill, but when I told you what he did, you made those assumptions. When I told you Bill was a corporate investigator, you really didn't have those assumptions. So Bill needs to earn those. So the image is different between the two in such that a public investigator inherits their standing. When you make a police detective, you are automatically thought to be a certain type of person and to have certain traits. When you are a corporate investigator, you must earn that. You must gain that respect from those who are your client base, the employees of your company, and the leadership of your company. It's not just assumed that you have certain traits and that you will act a certain way and that you will do certain things that are for the good of the public or the company. Civil liability is a big difference between the two. Public investigators enjoy what's called governmental immunity, and I will, for those who have not taken criminal justice courses or some of the criminal justice courses, let me explain governmental immunity. If I decide I want to sue a government agency, I first have to go to a court to get the right. And in essence, it's been said that the government needs to give permission to be sued. If I want to sue one of you, I decide I want to sue one of you because you gave me a bad student review at the end of the course. By the way, I look forward to those because I learn from them, so don't worry. But if I decide to do that, I can go to Butler County and file a suit, and they will serve that suit. Whether it has merit or not, if I want to file a suit, I can file a suit. You can countersue and say my suit is frivolous and ask for money just for the inconvenience, but I don't have to ask permission to sue anybody, and you don't have to ask permission to sue anybody. You can do it. You may have certain liability afterwards, but you can do it. When it comes to the government, I must first go to a court to get permission to sue the government. I can't just file a suit against the government because they can claim immunity. So a public investigator enjoys that immunity, where the corporation and the corporate investigator do not. That really hurts us when it comes to promises made. So the police can say, look, if you give me what, you give up somebody, I'll go to the prosecutor and I'll put in a good word for you. And you don't do that, right? The policeman doesn't do that. I can't sue that policeman. He promised he was going to, go to the prosecutor and put in a good word for me. I don't have any standing in that. However, a corporate investigator who says, look, I promise if you cooperate with me and give me what I need, I'm not going to pursue prosecution. I have just taken prosecution off the table. I have to make good on that promise. As an agent for the company, I am able and authorized to make promises on behalf of that corporation, and those promises must be kept. So a corporation can be sued if they go back on their word. Now, I don't have to be totally truthful, and we'll get into that. There's a little difference between withholding information. I don't suggest anybody be untruthful in anything they do, but there are ways for you to not put everything out there and get information that you need, and we'll talk about that in later weeks. But you can't make false promises because you are an agent of the company and you are promising on their behalf, and you could set yourself up for civil liability, and no one needs to ask permission to do that. And the deeper the pockets, the higher the stakes. If you work for a big company, then the amount that someone sues for is going to be a bigger amount, and you're more likely to be sued. If you're a mom and pop type shop and you have 10 people and you happen to be the corporate investigator, or the person in HR who is tasked with doing corporate investigations, more like, it's unlikely someone's going to sue you for multi-millions of dollars, or that the court would award such a thing. It would put the business out of business. But if you work for a company like I work for most days, where the market cap is around $230, $240 billion, somebody suing you for $1 million is not considered a large suit, and the court will often award that type of money. It doesn't seem like a big amount to a big company. So the deeper the pockets, the higher the stakes. And corporations don't have the protection of government immunity from lawsuits. So the stakes are much higher on the civil liability side. Again, putting a higher onus on the corporate investigator to be right and be right the first time. One of the big differences is that police departments have technical resources they can borrow and they can sell to others. If you are in a police department that has a crime lab, you can contract out your crime lab in most jurisdictions to another police department that doesn't have one. So not every police department in a county or in a state needs to have a crime lab. They may use the state police crime lab, and they pay a fee for that service. And police departments generally are willing to share that, especially for a fee in light of, budgets being cut everywhere. They certainly are willing to sell those services if they have excess capacity. That can be data, that can be services, can be tools, could be anything. It's not unusual for one police department to rent one of those speed trailers from another one in small jurisdictions. There may be one or two of them in the county, and a particular city may say, I'd like to have it for the month of July, and they say that's $200 and you get it for the month of July. Why go out and buy one when you can rent one, right, from another department? And it becomes government money going to government money, so it's pretty palatable to most people in the jurisdictions. Corporate investigators don't share information and don't share services and tools, mostly because of what we talked about before, that liability. And I'll give you an example. I did a case, and I'm still completing the case right now because it will go to prosecution, on stolen computers. And we had a contractor who worked for a company called DXC. DXC is a fairly large company, actually, headquartered in Texas, that will provide employees to work in your help desk, right? People who go around in a big factory, let's say, and set up laptops for people. A new employee comes in, they get them a new laptop. They need updates to software. They go desk side support, and they help you upgrade your software and hook up your printer and those kinds of things. And a lot of companies won't hire their own people to do that. They'll buy that as a service. And DXC is one company that provides that service. CompuCom is another big one that does that. There's a lot of them out there, and they're good companies, and this is a good company. And we had an employee of DXC who we believe was stealing laptop computers from us. He was in charge of doing changeouts. So you would get a new computer every 3 years, and your old one would be collected. And then we would sell your old one. We would wipe it clean, and we would sell it to a service that indeed would sell them as secondhand computers to people. And it's pretty common to do that. Or we would collect them, and then we would redeploy them for certain automation, for interns, contracted people who just needed to have a computer that worked, Excel and Word and the basic programs. They wouldn't need to have something with high computing power. We would give our employees a new one every 3 years, take that old one and redeploy it. and he was redeploying them out to eBay and a series of people that he would sell them to, and got us for a fair number of them before it was discovered. Now, he was a DXC employee, and when I called DXC to ask them about the background on this person, they were unwilling to share much on the background. They were nice enough about it, and I understood why. This isn't personal, it's just business, right? But they weren't willing to share with me that this person, in a background check, had previously been arrested, convicted, and jailed. Actually did 1 year in state prison in the state of North Dakota for stealing laptop computers from a previous employer. And he had a pending criminal charge in that same state, in a different jurisdiction, different city, for doing it to another employer. I found that out separately. Now, DXC knew that when I said, what have you got on this guy? What can you tell me about him? They basically said they really couldn't divulge any information. They couldn't share that data for liability purposes. And so, you understand it. But police departments, they would have said, oh, yeah, we got him here. Look, yeah, we arrested him in Bismarck, North Dakota. He spent some time in prison up here for this. He got 2 to 10, served a year, got out for good behavior. And then there was a warrant issued in Williston, North Dakota for him for doing the same thing. And he ran from that. So that one's a pickup warrant within 500 miles. Pick him up and deliver him back if he's within 500 miles of Bismarck. And, police departments would share that right away. They'd have that information. And in fact, you probably would talk to the arresting officer who'd be able to tell you whether this guy was a flight risk, whether he was someone who's going to wrestle you to the ground when you try to arrest him. You get all that great information. Companies don't share that. There's a liability there. They don't share it. However, you just learn. It's a skill you learn to listen, and you sometimes learn what you hear, but you're not really hearing, right? When somebody says, I really can't share any information on this person with you, what they're saying is there's information to share. So don't stop digging. Or if they say, no, I've got nothing, and that's the way it is, there's nothing, then they'll usually tell you it's nothing. So the availability of technical resources is a really high constraint for the private sector. But there are some resources that are built into every business. And so I will have records on comings and goings with my access control system. When they run a badge to come in and out of work, I would have video on this person. When they come in to work in the morning, I'd be able to go and see what car they drive, right? I don't have to rely on the police for all of those technical resources and all that information. If I'm investigating a truck driver for doing something, I may have a GPS device on the truck or in the load that he's carrying to tell me where he's been every minute of every day with that truck, whereas the police would not have access to that. So there are technical resources that are built into every business. If you're investigating somebody for misconduct in the job they're doing, oftentimes there are certain tools associated with the job which will help you. But for the most part, the technical resources in the corporate setting are harder to come by and much less shared between corporate resources. And finally, prosecution decisions. And this is a big difference between the two. And this is the one that I think gives a very distinct advantage to a corporate investigator versus a criminal investigator. And that is the fact that a crime doesn't have to be reported. So let's say that I come into your apartment or home and, in a drunken stupor one night, and I light your bathroom on fire. Police department comes, and it's me. I'm your friend, right? And you say, I don't want to press charges. It doesn't work that way. People don't press charges. Prosecutors press charges. When someone says, I will press charges or I won't press charges, what they're really saying is, I will cooperate or I will not cooperate in this investigation. And if someone says, I won't press charges, the police department and the prosecutor often will say, well, look, if they're not going to cooperate, then it's very hard for me to make the case. Then I'm probably going to forego the prosecution. But in the case of lighting your bathroom on fire, the fire department had to come and people's lives were put at risk. If you say, I'm not going to press charges, don't worry about it. If the police came, they're likely to say, yeah, too bad, Brian's getting arrested for arson. So crimes in the case of the police normally have to be reported or at least recorded. They must refer a criminal case that they have if they find that a crime was committed to a prosecutor, who then will decide whether or not the crime will go to court. A corporate investigator has wide discretion to refer cases to criminal court or to look for other means of relief. So I have had cases where someone has embezzled money, and that amount of money has been quite large. The crime was committed. I don't have to take that crime forward to the police and say, this guy embezzled $1 million from me. I need him to go to jail, I can, rather than alert my stakeholders, have something go in the media that's bad about the company, right? Somebody embezzled over there, a bunch of thieves over there. I don't want that in the paper. I have the discretion to say, you know what? You're going to pay me back. How much of that $1 million do you still have left? Where is it? I want it back. I have that discretion to not take that criminal matter to police because I am the victim. The corporation is the victim. And in the case where the corporation is the victim, I don't necessarily need to bring that forward. Now, if there's another victim, okay, like in an assault, if someone is assaulted on my property and they say, I've been assaulted and I want to report it to the police, I cannot stop that, and nor would I want to stop it. But if they say, I don't care what you do, I just don't want this guy near me anymore, then I don't need to report that to the police. That is not my job to do that. I only need to report things to the police where there's another victim and that other victim insists that be reported. Whereas the police don't have that discretion. If there's been a crime committed, they know there's been a crime committed, they need to make a criminal report. It doesn't always go to prosecution, but they need to do that. I have the discretion to say, you know what, I'll just handle this myself, so long as there's not another victim. There are certain crimes, obviously, that must be reported. When we find child pornography on a computer, which does happen in large companies all the time, cybersecurity guys will tell you that, I have an obligation to report that and to isolate that to make sure it goes no farther. But if I find other questionable materials that's not necessarily illegal, or if it's a victimless crime, then I have the discretion to decide whether or not to report that to the police. And we use that quite widely, and that's an advantage as a corporate investigator. So you would think after all of those differences in the two that it's much better to be a public investigator because you have all the access to all the tools and access to prison as an option, and you can trade information. It is much better to be a public investigator. And I would say that that's not necessarily true. First off, a generalist enjoys variety. If you are a homicide investigator, you better darn well enjoy being a homicide investigator because that's what you're going to do is dead bodies all the time. Some people like that, some people do not. I tend to like a variety of work, and a generalist is a better way to go. And our investigations tend to be part of a wider variety of security manager duties. So we're not just pigeonholed as investigators. You're an investigator, but you might also be a risk manager. You might be working on enterprise risk for your entire organization. You might be working on intelligence matters. There are lots of things you work on, and I like that variety. And I think when we say corporate investigator, most of the time that is a part of a security manager's role, not an isolated security investigator role. There are very few of those out there. There are some, but I will tell you right now, you're not going to leave Slippery Rock and become a corporate investigator somewhere. It doesn't work that way. You'll become a generalist and have other things to do. Investigations will be part of that job. Corporate investigators earn the same. I looked up the average pay for a corporate investigator and the average pay for a police detective, and then they both sit somewhere around $65,000 a year. But corporate investigators have a much higher earning potential. Won't go into much detail, but I know what the commissioner at the NYPD makes, and I know what I make, and I wouldn't trade. The potential is much higher in the private sector. That is just a factor of the way companies work. Companies that make money tend to be able to spend more money, and entities that don't make money tend to be tighter with the dollars. There are benefit differences and pension differences, perhaps, but the higher earning potential definitely sits on the privatized side. There's no question. Investigative matters are more quickly decided in industry, and so the corporate investigator doesn't have a case that goes 2 years. Normally, you do have a time limit. Because if you come across a suspect or a subject of investigation, you normally will put that person on administrative leave. If the person is suspected of, say, embezzling, you're not going to continue to have them working in the workplace once you have turn that corner in your investigative case that says, this is probably my guy. I have a confidence level of 80%. This is my person. You're not going to continue to have them do the books for you. You're going to put them on administrative leave, continue to pay them normally. That's normally how it works. And while they're there, they're not being productive. So the company's losing that resource while you investigate. You can't let that go on forever. Whereas a police matter, that case can go on for some time, and I have seen those go years for sure. And I do like the speed at which a corporate investigation goes. I like to get the case cleared and decided quickly. And there's some leverage we have. So if someone is caught smoking marijuana in the public, in most jurisdictions, they're going to pay a $50 fine in those states where it's not yet legalized, right? It's a ticket. It's usually about a $50 fine. If I catch you smoking marijuana on the job and it is against company policy for you to do so, and we'll talk about company policies and the fact that you need to have those in order to make any kind of cases. Let's just say we have a policy that says you can't, use illicit drugs in a jurisdiction where marijuana is an illicit drug. You're doing that. It's not a $50 fine. I can say you violated the policy and you're going to be terminated. Someone, I make that case and I take it forward and somebody makes a decision, you'll be terminated. So whereas the police ticket costs $50, my punishment costs you a job which may be, $50,000, $100,000 per year. And it is very hard to go find another job when you've been fired for one, when you get to that level, because you have to explain why you're no longer there. And it's because of a violation of policy, and especially one as simple as just not getting high at work. That's a hard thing to overcome in a job interview. So my punishments can be much more financially damaging to a person than some police ones, and especially for less severe matters. So we have that leverage of not only the job and the income, but the reputational harm that comes from job loss. Do you really want to go home and tell your spouse that you lost the job and you can't buy groceries for the family because you were smoking pot at work? It's not something that somebody wants to do. So that gives the corporate investigator a fair amount of leverage to work with someone to get the facts of the case and to get more information about the matter so that they can proceed with their investigation. So I still think it's better. It's different. And I think that's the big thing I want to get across to you this week, is that the two of them are certainly different. So what does this mean for the corporate investigator, and what do you have to do differently? And there are several things you need to do, and certainly a more business-like approach is necessary. If you think about a police investigation and think about one on TV, you certainly don't want to go about an investigation in a corporate setting like that. And our assignment this week is going to show you why that's a bad idea. So you have to have a more business-like approach to your investigations than the public investigator does. You also need to be right the first time. I will challenge you to find an episode of Law & Order, any version of it, that got the right guy right the first time. It's always they arrest somebody for the case, then find out somebody else did it. It's almost always that way. You really can't do that in a corporate setting. You can't say, I'm suspending Bill because I think Bill is my guy, and then find out it's not Bill. I mean, that's a rarity. You want to have a high degree of confidence before you take any action. So you really must be right the first time, and that's very hard to do. And so that puts another onus on there. And plus, there's that whole thing about the liability, right? Civil liability. So you really want to be right the first time. You can't threaten jail time. Now, you can allude to it, and we'll go into that when we talk about interviewing subjects. But you can't say, look, if you don't cooperate with me, I'm going to have you arrested and you're going to jail. I can't do that because I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that a prosecutor would take the matter based on the evidence that I have forward. I don't know the prosecutor well enough, and I'm not someone who's doing proofs based on law. I'm doing it based on policy. Again, the lesson for next week. So you can't really threaten jail time. Okay? You can suggest that criminal result. You can suggest that there might be a criminal result, or not be a criminal result, based on the facts you know. So you can say, look, this is what I know, and right now you haven't even committed a crime, so certainly I'm not going to make this a police matter. But you can only do that based on the currently known facts, because as you tend to investigate, you may find the person did commit a crime, and that crime may be something that you must take forward, one of the ones we'll discuss over the course of the term. And so you really can't say that you're not going to prosecute. You can say that you can allude to the fact that I'm not going to necessarily take this to the police because we haven't really seen a crime committed yet, what we know today. And given that, and if you look at interrogations, and I'll use TV and movies, and we're going to do that this week again. because I think it's pretty indicative of the way that people perceive and the way that some interviews and interrogations go. From experience seeing that. Interrogation is not a corporate investigator tool. Corporate investigators use interviews, and the interview is done totally different than an interrogation. And you should never get to the point where you are interrogating, because then you've taken that step too far and you've gone beyond what your authority is. An interrogation is a way to elicit a confession. I don't necessarily need a confession. That burden of proof is not there for me. And we'll talk about burden of proof as well later on. But again, the things that you do differently really come down to a business-like approach, being right, and not making false promises. If you can do those things and do it in a calm manner, you will make a good corporate investigator. The best corporate investigator I ever met, a gentleman named David Hawks, and I worked with him for about 20 years. I swear the man's heart beat once every 20 minutes. He was the most calm guy, and people would just tell him things. He would talk to you, and his voice would darn near put you to sleep. And then he would just ask you a question about your involvement in something, and you'd say, yeah, that was me. I stole that. Yep. A business-like approach, a calm business-like approach, is really the difference between the two, and that's something that we're going to learn this semester. So here's your assignment for the week, and it's a discussion. It's in the discussion board. You're going to pick a police investigation show or movie. I would suggest Law and Order versions. Any one of the Law and Orders, SVU or the original or Light or whatever. The SUV is a good one because they normally do a lot of interrogation scenes. But I want you to look at it and take notes as you go along. Knowing what you know from this lecture, I want you to count and to note how many things those investigators did that relied on methods and tools and the things that I said were not necessarily available to a corporate investigator, the differences. So look, they're going to rely on fingerprints. Well, you don't really have access to a fingerprint lab as a corporate investigator. I suppose you could hire one if you thought so, but I've never had the reason to do that. Think about the tools they use and the methods they use, and think about whether or not they would fit in a corporate setting. Then I want you, when you're done, to think about the interrogation and the interview scenes in that episode. Now, think about the way they treated that person, the way that the person was asked questions, the way they may have been accused of things. Now, 20 minutes later, you and that person are working for the same company, and you're going to see them in the cafeteria line. Or you're going to be assigned to work a project with them, because a lot of times security managers are assigned to work with somebody in the business to get a project done, somebody in IT, somebody in engineering, somebody in human resources, and those are people that you may have to investigate as a corporate investigator. I want you to tell me how you might feel if 20 minutes after the end of one of those interrogations that you saw on TV, if you were that investigator, how would you feel 20 minutes later if you saw them in the cafeteria and had to sit at a table with them and pretend none of that ever happened? Tell me how comfortable you'd be with that. And then tell me, what does that really tell you about the challenges, differences, and demeanor required of a corporate investigator? Knowing the differences between the two is hugely important to how we operate. If you try to operate as a police investigator, if you try to operate with the tools and the methods of a police investigator, you will fail as a corporate investigator. So what I'd like to do is to outline those differences, and the details are in the discussion board. So important takeaways for this week. There are distinct differences between public police investigations and corporate investigations. Corporate investigators have less authority. We have access to fewer tools, although we have different tools that we can use that the police can't necessarily get to without a warrant. We definitely have different standing. We look at a police investigator and a corporate investigator differently, and that may help or hurt our chances of success. But we have wider discretion in prosecution, where we can decide as the victim, if indeed the company is the victim, whether or not we want to, send someone to jail or, try to get them to be arrested and sent to jail, or whether we want to handle it in a different way. Perhaps fire the person, perhaps counsel the person, perhaps it just requires a change in behavior, or whether we want them to pay us back privately. Public investigations have a loyalty to the public. That is where the loyalty lies. Corporate investigators have a loyalty to the organization. Certainly, if certain types of crimes that must be reported, child pornography was one of the ones that I brought up, we will always report those types of things. Any good corporate investigator will do that because it is required to do so. But the loyalties to the organization and the way you report that may change, as opposed to going to the press and making a statement. And presenting the case is the last unit in this course, and we'll talk about that in particular, cases like child pornography and how you present those cases to law enforcement. But again, the loyalty issue. Where does the loyalty lie? And a corporate investigator's loyalty is to the organization that hired them, and their authority comes from the officers of that company. And a big one is that the tactics used by public investigators don't always play well in corporate setting, and they certainly can impede your success, and they certainly can get you sued. The assignment this week is for you to look at some of those tactics as they're portrayed in dramas, but I would suggest that some of those dramas are quite realistic when it comes to many police departments, and frankly, many police officers get their level of training, if you will, from repeatedly watching those behaviors and mimicking those behaviors. And so I'd like you to look at those tactics and tell me why you think they wouldn't work in a corporate setting, knowing what you know today. With that, we are at the 45-minute mark. There is no separate reading this week. It is the lecture. It is the viewing. I'll consider that to be your reading, right? Viewing a 1-hour episode of a police drama or a 2-hour movie if you so desire. Again, I suggest the Law and Order ones because they always have the elements that we're looking for this assignment, but you might have a favorite movie or TV show that you want to use instead. Go for it. And let us know how that worked out. Discussions are due at 5 p.m. Thursday. 5 p.m. SRU time Thursday. There are 2 responses to that are due at 11:59 p.m. Sunday. The first discussion is 250 words minimum. There are paragraphs. It's an essay, and I've outlined that, how many paragraphs you should have for each section. I won't do that as we go along, but we're going to do this early because good writing is part of good investigators' practice, so you're going to practice some of that as we go along. But again, this is due, the first post is due 5 p.m. Thursday. If you don't have it in by then, you're certainly going to take a hit. So please don't be late on that. With that, have a great week. I am here for you if you need to talk to me. Again, thank you for all your introductions in the previous week, and knock yourself out on that on this discussion. I really want to see some great feedback about how police investigations don't mimic what you believe a corporate investigator should do now that you know what you know.